Yeah, so now let's talk about the history of pharmacognosy. You should expect this one in your first tests. It's a very important concept. Usually you have to write an essay on the history. So you need to know the history is divided into three. You have the prehistoric era, the written history era, and the modern era. So in the prehistoric era, in this era, there isn't much to say. So information about medicinal plants and herbs was passed on through oral transmission via word of mouth. And then in the written history era, we have six major contributions. Western history, the Unani, the Ayurveda, the Orient, we had Greek history, and then we had the African system. So let's expand. When you talk about Western medicine, I want you to think of three things. Ancient Mesopotamia, think of the Ibis papyrus, and think of the Pharmacopoeia. So when you think of ancient Mesopotamia, Mesopotamia can be divided into two words. So we have Meso and Potamia. So Meso means between, Potamia means rivers. So it's this fertile plain of land, currently where Iraq is, right? That's located between two rivers, which are the Tigris and the Euphrates River. So it's considered to be the origin of civilization, because concepts like law, concepts like astronomy, farming, literacy all began in ancient Mesopotamia. And so one thing you'll be able to see is that the ancient Mesopotamians, the Sumerians, devised this style of writing that was called cuneiform. We now call it cuneiform. And so cuneiform tablets were left behind, and then they contained a lot of information about medicinally relevant plants, right? Then when you talk about Egypt, I want you to think of the Ibis papyrus. So it dates back to 1550 BC. Some literature will say 1600. Same thing. I don't want you to get too worked up on the dates. And then the Ibis papyrus was purchased at Luxor by a German Egyptologist by the name of Georg Ibis. And then currently, this papyrus is stored at Leipzig University Library. So if you're following the psychology series, what else happened at Leipzig University? This is where Wilhelm Wundt started the first lab to study the conscious mind. So I just thought I should throw that in. And so the Ibis papyrus had 110 pages. It was a scroll, right? And then it was 20 meters long. It was quite long. It also listed 800 prescriptions, and then also had 700 drugs. That's some of the things you can think about. And then lastly, talk about the pharmacopoeia. So a pharmacopoeia is a reference book that's used when manufacturing in order to ensure quality of drugs and also to unify the drugs. And so we have two major pharmacopoeias here, of the London Pharmacopoeia, which was in 1618, and also the British Pharmacopoeia in 1864. So the next contribution is the Unani. So when you talk about the Unani, the major individual that contributed to a majority of the work from the Unani is an Arabian Muslim by the name of Avicenna. Some literature will call him Ibn Sena, so don't get confused. So born between the years 1980 AD and it should be 1037, about 1037 AD. And so who was Avicenna? Avicenna was a prince, was a ruler, a physician, was a philosopher. A majority of his work was actually in philosophy, who wrote about 450 books by the time he died at 59, right? So he wrote quite a lot of books. So why was he able to write so many books? He was a prodigy, right? If I pronounce that word correctly. So why am I saying this? By the age of 10, he was able to memorize the entire Quran. That's just how impressive this individual was. And so he had over 450 books, right? But then the major book that contributed to pharmacognosy was a book called the Kitab al-Shifa, which translates to the book of healing, right? So that's what you should think about. Next contribution is the Ayurveda, or the Ayurvedic source. So this is the Indian source, or the Indian contribution to pharmacognosy. And then Ayu means life, Veda means study. So it's generally or roughly the study of life. And so when you talk about the Ayurveda, It's divided into 3 samhitas. So we have the Charaka Samhita, the Sushruta Samhita, and the Astanga Samhita. So you need to know these samhitas. So the Charaka Samhita is actually the oldest. It dates back to around 700 or 600 BC, I think. Yeah. And then it describes the use of metallic drugs, things like mercury, iron, sulfur, copper, although we don't use mercury anymore. So if you watch the previous video, you'll be able to see that mercury is actually toxic. So it's an example of unofficial drugs, mercury compounds. And so the next contribution is the Orient. So the Orient, this is the contribution of the Chinese, the Japanese, and the Tibet. So the herbalism of this period was called the Kampo. And then one thing you need to know is that there was this emperor by the name of Sheng Nang. So Sheng Nang wrote this book called the Pentisao, very rich source of information about drugs. And so he wrote this book in 2700 BC. And then next thing we can discuss the Greek contribution. So the first person we can discuss is Hippocrates. So Hippocrates is considered the father of medicine. So what was his major contribution? Hippocrates is considered the first natural doctor because he was able to utilize simple herbs such as honey and vinegar in order for him to treat or heal patients. And then what other individual can we talk about? We can talk about Aristotle. So another thing, Hippocrates, please focus on the years because there'll be some situations where you have to match years against characters. So that's 460 to 370 BC. And then Aristotle, that is 384 to 322 BC, around that time. So Aristotle was mainly a philosopher. And so his major contribution was he developed the philosophy of medicine, right? So he's said to have discovered over 500 plants. And then we have Theophrastus. Theophrastus was a student of Aristotle. His major contribution was that he was able to develop a system of nomenclature of plants, especially. And so for that reason, he's called the father of botany. The reason we don't use a system of classification is because it was quite bulky and cumbersome. So we'll discuss that when we talk about nomenclature. And so it was replaced by Carl Linnaeus' system of classification, the binomial system that we use today. Next person we can talk about is Pedonius Dioscorides, very important guy. And so Pedonius Dioscorides, in some contexts, in some books, is called the father of pharmacy. I think he should be called the father of pharmacognosy because the book he wrote literally became Pharmacognosy. Anyway, so Dioscorides, the years are 40 to 80 AD, right? And then his major contributions, he had 2 major contributions. The first one was this book called the Materia Medica, And then this book listed over 600 plants, very important book. It actually became, Materia Medica is actually became Pharmacognosy. And then we also have the Greek Herbal of Dioscorides, which had 5,000 medicinal plants. And then lastly, we have Galen. So Galen, think of the years 131 to 200 AD, right? So he's known for developing methods of preparing compounds. So usually these methods were mechanical, so by use of his hands, right? And then he created the original formula for cod cream. So cod cream is a cosmetic. Yeah. Lastly, we have the African source or the African system. So in the African system, this is a system that is the richest source of unexplored drugs, the richest source. And then why is it so rich? It's because in this system, information is passed on from one tribe, it's passed on within a tribe from generation to generation. So they are quite secretive with their information. So areas that use this system will include areas in Africa, North America, and also South America. Lastly, we'll talk about the modern era. So when you talk about the modern era, I want you to think of it in terms of centuries. So in the 18th century, the major contribution, there are so many contributions that I could take the whole day explaining the contributions. But the major contributions of the 18th century was Carl Linnaeus and Johann Adams' contributions towards classification. So we see Carl Linnaeus wrote the Species Plantum, which showed how to classify plants and animals also. Actually, organisms. It showed how to classify organisms using only two names. So I have the genus and the species name, right? We'll talk about that later on. And then in the 19th century, we have the 19th century is also called the era of isolation of pure compounds. Here we have isolation of pure compounds. So I want you to memorize this one, very important. So I was saying in 1803, this is the year when morphine was isolated from opium. In 1820, it's when quinine and caffeine were isolated. In 1828, it's when we isolated nicotine. In 1833, we isolated atropine. In 1835 should be cocaine. This is when we isolated cocaine. And then the 20th century. In the 20th century, this is when we started to use more modern therapies like hormonal-based therapies and vitamin-based therapies. You know, we'd use things like insulin, right, to treat diabetes. And then also we'd use things like cyanocobalamin to treat variations of anemia. I think we use it for pernicious anemia. And then we'd use ascorbic acid, which is vitamin C, for scurvy, right? And so that will mark the end.